August 29th, 1968, 2:42 a.m. Pacific Ocean, 1,160 nautical miles northwest of Hawaii. The temperature inside K-129's control room had dropped to 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Captain First Rank Vladimir Kobzar stood beside the periscope housing, watching his executive officer plot their position on the navigation chart. The submarine's diesel engines hummed through the pressure hull, a sound that should have been reassuring but somehow wasn't. Outside, 3 miles of black water pressed against the steel with 6,800 pounds per square inch. Kobzar pulled his wool peacoat tighter. The heating system was malfunctioning again, just like the communications array that had failed to raise Kamchatka Naval Base for the past 6 hours. Something felt wrong. The Golf II-class ballistic missile submarine carried 3 nuclear-armed R-21 missiles in her sail, each capable of reaching San Francisco or Los Angeles. 98 men aboard, 70 days into an 80-day patrol, and they should have been heading home. Instead, Moscow had ordered them to maintain station at these coordinates. No explanation, just coordinates and silence. In the sonar compartment, Senior Lieutenant Zhirov pressed his headphones tighter against his ears. He'd been hearing something for the past 20 minutes. Not American hunter-killer submarines. He knew those signatures by heart. This was different. A low-frequency pulse, regular as a heartbeat, coming from somewhere far below. Impossible, he thought. Nothing operates at that depth. The abyssal plain beneath them dropped to 16,500 feet. Even steel implodes at pressures like that. Kobzar checked his watch, 2:43 a.m. In Moscow, it was 2:43 p.m. Admiral Golisov would be reviewing patrol reports at Pacific Fleet headquarters. Kobzar wondered if he should break radio silence, report the heating failure and communications problems. But Moscow had been explicit. Maintain communications blackout unless absolutely critical. He reached for the intercom to order another systems check. He never completed the order. At 2:44 a.m., something catastrophic happened in K-129's battery compartment. Whether it was hydrogen gas accumulation from overcharged batteries, a hydraulic system rupture, or something else entirely would remain disputed for decades. What matters is this: the explosion tore through 3 compartments in 1.7 seconds. Seawater poured through ruptured hull plates at 400 gallons per second. The submarine's bow pitched downward at 43 degrees. Captain Kobzar had perhaps 8 seconds of consciousness before the pressure differential crushed the control room. K-129 began her final dive, tumbling through the thermocline, shedding debris and bodies, accelerating toward the ocean floor 16,500 feet below. By 2:47 a.m., she had disappeared from the surface of the Earth. The Soviet Pacific Fleet spent the next 74 days searching 20,000 square miles of ocean. They found nothing. K-129 had vanished so completely that some in Soviet naval intelligence suspected defection, that Kobzar had somehow surfaced the boat and surrendered to the Americans. Others whispered about experimental American anti-submarine weapons, underwater directed energy systems that could crack a pressure hull without warning. The truth was simpler and more terrible. K-129 had suffered a catastrophic malfunction and sunk in some of the deepest water in the Pacific. Soviet search vessels passed directly over her gravesite 3 times without detecting her. Their sonar couldn't penetrate that deep, but the United States Navy's sound surveillance system could. The SOSUS network was the most secret and sophisticated underwater listening system ever built. Hundreds of hydrophones scattered across the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean floors, connected by 18,000 miles of submarine cable to shore stations where Navy cryptologic technicians sat in climate-controlled rooms, wearing headphones, listening to the ocean. They heard Soviet submarines before those submarines knew they were being tracked. They heard whale songs, undersea earthquakes, volcanic eruptions. And on August 29th, 1968, at 2:44 a.m. Pacific Time, station Navfac Point Sur in California recorded something extraordinary. The acoustic signature was unmistakable, a catastrophic hull implosion, followed by the specific sound profile of a submarine breaking apart under extreme pressure, then the extended low-frequency rumble of heavy debris impacting the abyssal seafloor. The hydrophones triangulated the position to within 12 miles. Senior Chief Petty Officer James Bradley, on duty that night, immediately classified the recording Pinnacle Empty Quiver, the code designation for a broken arrow event involving nuclear weapons. He alerted the Office of Naval Intelligence by encrypted teletype at 3:17 a.m. By sunrise, ONI knew that a Soviet ballistic missile submarine carrying nuclear weapons had sunk in the Pacific. More importantly, they knew exactly where. The Soviets did not. This intelligence asymmetry, this secret knowledge of K-129's location, represented the most valuable strategic opportunity of the entire Cold War. The submarine contained Soviet nuclear warheads, cipher machines, cryptographic materials, nuclear torpedo designs, acoustic quieting technology, metallurgical secrets, and possibly evidence of Soviet missile targeting strategies. Every intelligence agency in the United States government wanted what lay inside that broken hull, but retrieving it would require solving an engineering problem that most experts considered impossible. lifting a 2,000-ton submarine from 16,500 feet below the surface, in secret, without the Soviets discovering the operation. The official story, the version both superpowers believed throughout 1968 and early 1969, was straightforward. K-129 was lost at sea, cause unknown, location unknown. The Soviet Navy conducted extensive search operations, but eventually declared the submarine destroyed with all hands. Memorial services were held. Widows received pensions. The Pacific Fleet learned hard lessons about communications protocols and battery maintenance. Life continued. Washington said nothing. The United States had no comment on Soviet submarine losses. Why would we? We were competitors, not allies. If Soviet submarines wanted to sink themselves through poor maintenance and operational incompetence, that was their problem. Except that in February 1969, the U.S. Navy sent the deep submergence vehicle Halibut to investigate the wreck site. Halibut was a modified nuclear submarine equipped with underwater cameras and a fish, a camera sled towed 50 feet above the ocean floor on a cable. For 3 weeks, Halibut conducted what the Navy called oceanographic research in the Central Pacific. What they actually did was take 22,000 photographs of K-129's broken hull, scattered across the abyssal plain like a dissected mechanical corpse. The photographs were extraordinary. K-129 had broken into 3 major sections. The forward compartment, containing the control room, navigation systems, and cipher equipment, had imploded but was largely intact. The center section, including the missile tubes, had fractured, but the missiles themselves appeared recoverable. The aft section, containing the nuclear reactor, had separated completely. Bodies were visible through ruptured hull plates, preserved in the near-freezing water, frozen in whatever position they'd occupied when death came. CIA Director Richard Helms received the photographs on March 4, 1969. He spent 17 minutes studying them in complete silence, then looked up at the ONI briefing officer. "We need to bring that up," he said. "All of it." The briefing officer, Commander Wilson, cleared his throat. "Sir, the engineering challenges—" "I don't care," Helms interrupted. "Find someone who can do it." What happened next would become the most audacious covert operation in CIA history, an engineering marvel disguised as corporate capitalism. A 6-year conspiracy involving thousands of people who somehow kept the secret. But in March 1969, it was just an idea. An impossible idea that would require inventing new technology, building the largest ship ever constructed, and convincing the world that eccentric billionaire Howard Hughes was searching for manganese nodules on the ocean floor. The geopolitical stakes were extraordinary. By 1969, the Cold War had entered its most dangerous phase. The Soviet Union had achieved nuclear parity with the United States. Both sides possessed thousands of warheads. The doctrine of mutual assured destruction meant that any miscalculation could trigger Armageddon. In this environment, intelligence was everything. Knowing Soviet missile capabilities, targeting strategies, and cryptographic systems could mean the difference between deterrence and disaster. K-129's cargo was priceless. Nuclear warheads containing design secrets that could reveal Soviet miniaturization. Capabilities: SSN-5 ballistic missiles with guidance systems that could expose Soviet accuracy limitations. Code machines that could unlock months or years of intercepted communications. Acoustic quieting technology that could help American sonar operators detect Soviet submarines more effectively. Nuclear torpedoes with possibly tactical yield warheads. And most valuable of all, documentation that might reveal Soviet strategic war plans. But there was something else, something that made the intelligence community's pulse quicken. K-129 had been on patrol near Hawaii when she sank. The trajectory analysis suggested she was heading toward a launch position within range of Pearl Harbor and the West Coast. Had the submarine been conducting a practice run for a nuclear first strike? Were those missiles pre-targeted on American cities? The only way to know was to examine the guidance systems firsthand. The key players assembled quickly. Richard Helms brought in Carl Duckett, the CIA's Deputy Director for Science and Technology, the man who'd overseen development of the U-2 spy plane and the Corona reconnaissance satellites. Duckett was known for solving impossible problems. And this was impossible. No salvage operation had ever worked at depths beyond 6,000 feet. K-129 lay almost 3 miles deeper. Duckett convened a meeting of naval architects, ocean engineers, and deep-sea recovery specialists on March 18, 1969, at CIA headquarters. The meeting was classified Top Secret Umbra, the highest classification in U.S. government. Even the topic of the meeting was classified. Participants were told only that they were to discuss deep ocean engineering challenges. 32 people attended. By the end of that first session, 28 had declared the project impossible. The 4 who remained believed it could be done. One of them was John Parangoski, a CIA officer who'd spent 20 years managing classified aerospace programs. Another was Curtis Crook, an engineer from Global Marine Development who'd designed the Glomar Challenger, a deep-sea drilling ship. The third was John Graham, a naval architect who'd calculated that a ship could theoretically be built with a derrick tall enough and strong enough to lift 2,000 tons from 16,500 feet depth. The fourth was an oddball mechanical engineer named Sherman Wetmore, who'd once designed an underwater robotic claw for recovering nuclear bomb components from test sites in the Pacific. Wetmore sketched his idea on a conference room whiteboard, a massive ship with a center well, a hole cut through the hull from deck to keel. Suspended inside that well, an enormous claw mechanism called a capture vehicle. Lower the claw on a pipe string, essentially a giant drill pipe, to the ocean floor. Close the claw around the submarine. Hoist everything up inside the ship through the center well, hidden from Soviet surveillance satellites and surface vessels. Everyone stared at the sketch. "You're describing a ship that doesn't exist," someone said. "Not yet," Wetmore replied. Parangosky was named project director. The operation received the cryptonym Azorian, randomly selected from CIA's computer-generated codename database. For years afterward, it would be mistakenly called Project Jennifer, but Jennifer was actually the codename for the cover story. Azorian was the real operation. Parangosky's first decision was to approach Howard Hughes. The billionaire industrialist was perfect, eccentric enough that people would believe he was pursuing some bizarre ocean floor mining scheme, rich enough that building a massive specialty ship wouldn't seem suspicious, and reclusive enough that he never appeared in public and could be impersonated by CIA officers if necessary. CIA representatives met with Hughes's senior executives at the Romaine Street office complex in Hollywood on April 2, 1969. They needed to use Hughes' corporate identity as cover for the operation. In exchange, the CIA would pay all costs, indemnify Hughes Tool Company against legal liability, and provide classified technology that could later be commercialized. The Hughes executives agreed. One of them asked whether Howard Hughes himself needed to be briefed. The CIA officer smiled thinly. "Mr. Hughes has certain health concerns that make detailed briefings impractical." Everyone understood. Hughes was so isolated by his mental illness and drug addiction that he'd never know his company was building a submarine salvage ship for the CIA. The cover story was brilliant. Hughes would create a new division called Summa Corporation, which would announce plans to mine manganese nodules from the deep ocean floor. Manganese nodules were real, potato-sized rocks containing nickel, copper, cobalt, and manganese scattered across the abyssal plains. Several corporations were genuinely interested in deep-sea mining. Hughes's announcement wouldn't seem suspicious. The ship they'd build, designated the Hughes Glomar Explorer, would be described as a deep-ocean mining vessel. The massive pipe string for lowering and raising the capture vehicle would be explained as drill pipe for nodule collection. The enormous derrick would be a mining derrick. Everything had a plausible commercial explanation, except that every element was secretly designed for one purpose: stealing a Soviet submarine from the bottom of the ocean. The engineering challenges were staggering. No ship had ever been built with a center well large enough to swallow a submarine. No pipe string had ever been constructed capable of supporting 2,000 tons at 16,500 feet depth, while also rotating to prevent torsional failure. No claw mechanism had ever been designed to grip something as large and irregularly shaped as a broken submarine hull. Every component had to be invented from scratch. Curtis Crook's team at Global Marine began with the most basic question: how do you build a 618-foot ship with a 199-foot hole through the middle? The center well would eliminate the keel, the structural spine that gives ships longitudinal strength. Without a keel, the Glomar Explorer would flex and twist in heavy seas. The solution was to essentially build two half-ships connected by an incredibly strong transverse superstructure, with the center well creating a moon pool, a vertical shaft from the cargo hold down through the bottom of the hull, open to the ocean. The ship would displace 63,000 tons fully loaded. Her derrick would rise 250 feet above the waterline, tall as a 25-story building. The derrick's lifting capacity would be 16 million pounds, generated by a system of 12 massive winches. The pipe string would consist of 650 sections of specially manufactured steel pipe, each section 60 feet long, threaded together to create a string 39,000 feet long. More than 7 miles of pipe, weighing 1,450 tons. The pipe would be lowered at 100 feet per minute, meaning it would take 6 hours just to reach the ocean floor. But the truly ingenious component was the capture vehicle, the claw. Wetmore's team spent 18 months designing what they called the CV. It was 135 feet long and weighed 10,400 tons, heavier than most submarines. Imagine an enormous steel cage with 8 hydraulically powered claws, each claw as large as a city bus, arranged in a circle. The CV would be lowered open like a mechanical flower. When positioned over K-129's hull, the claws would close, gripping the submarine. Then the entire assembly, CV plus submarine, would be hoisted up through 16,500 feet of water and drawn inside the Glomar Explorer's moon pool, where engineers could dissect the submarine in secret. The CV's design incorporated 47 separate hydraulic systems, 226 pressure sensors, 63 closed-circuit television cameras, and a ballast system that could be adjusted during descent to maintain neutral buoyancy. It was the most sophisticated piece of ocean engineering ever constructed. It was also, potentially, a death trap. If anything went wrong at depth, a hydraulic failure, a structural fracture, a cable snap, the CV would either plummet uncontrollably to the seafloor or rocket to the surface, possibly ripping apart the Glomar Explorer in the process. While engineers solved technical problems, CIA operations officers solved security problems. Project Azorian would require more than 1,000 people: naval architects, welders, hydraulic specialists, pipe manufacturers, programmers, sonar operators, salvage experts, security personnel. Every one of them would need to be cleared for top-secret access. Every one of them would need to believe they were building a mining ship while actually building a submarine salvage vessel. The compartmentation had to be absolute. The CIA created an elaborate system of need-to-know compartments. Workers building the hull were told nothing about the capture vehicle. Workers building the CV were told it was for collecting mineral samples. Workers programming the navigation computers were given coordinates in the Atlantic, not the Pacific. Only 47 people knew the true mission. Everyone else worked on fragments, puzzle pieces that only made sense when assembled. Sun Shipbuilding in Pennsylvania received the contract to build the Glomar Explorer's hull. Construction began on November 1st, 1970. Workers were told they were building a deep-sea mining ship for Howard Hughes. The ship's unusual center well was explained as necessary for lowering mining equipment. Security was tight, but not suspiciously tight. Contractors working on classified Navy projects were accustomed to restricted areas and need-to-know protocols. The capture vehicle was built separately at the Lockheed Missiles and Space Facility in Redwood City, California. Lockheed told workers they were building a deep submergence research vehicle for oceanographic studies. The facility was surrounded by chain-link fencing and guarded by security personnel with German shepherds. No photographs allowed, no visitors. When workers asked why an oceanographic vehicle needed 8 enormous hydraulic claws, engineers explained they were for collecting manganese nodules. The explanation didn't quite make sense, but defense contractors learned not to ask too many questions. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the KGB was watching. Soviet intelligence had tracked K-129's patrol route until her final transmission on August 28, 1968. When the submarine failed to return, the KGB launched an investigation into possible defection or capture. The idea that K-129 had simply sunk seemed unlikely. Soviet submarines were robustly designed, and catastrophic failures were rare. Some KGB analysts suspected American involvement. Perhaps the submarine had been damaged by an American torpedo and was being held at some secret naval facility. These suspicions intensified in early 1969 when KGB surveillance detected unusual U.S. Navy activity in the Central Pacific. The submarine Halibut had deployed to an unspecified location for oceanographic research, a known cover story for intelligence operations. When Halibut returned to Pearl Harbor on March 20, 1969, KGB agents photographed unusual equipment being offloaded under heavy security. Something was happening. But what? The KGB sent a formal intelligence requirement to residencies worldwide. Report any information regarding K-129. The requirement was classified Особой важности. Особой важности meant special importance, the KGB's highest priority designation. Agents in Washington, London, Tokyo, and Sydney began filing reports. Most were speculation. Some were disinformation from CIA moles inside Soviet intelligence. A few came close to the truth. In August 1970, a KGB officer in Geneva reported that CIA had met with executives from Hughes Tool Company. The report was filed but not acted upon. The KGB saw no connection between an eccentric billionaire and a missing submarine. 6 months later, a KGB source in San Diego reported that a massive ship was being constructed at Sun Shipbuilding in Pennsylvania, supposedly for Howard Hughes. Again, the report went nowhere. The KGB's failure to detect Project Azorian wasn't incompetence. It was the fog of intelligence. Every day, Soviet intelligence collected thousands of fragments of information: ship construction, CIA meetings, Navy movements, corporate transactions. Finding the meaningful pattern within that noise was nearly impossible, especially when the pattern was deliberately obscured. CIA counterintelligence had seeded disinformation throughout the intelligence community. False trails that suggested the Hughes ship was exactly what it claimed to be, a mining vessel. The KGB investigated, found the cover story plausible, and moved on. But they kept watching. On November 4, 1972, the Hughes Glomar Explorer was launched at Sun Shipbuilding's Chester, Pennsylvania facility. She slid down the ways into the Delaware River at 11:23 a.m., her massive gray hull displacing water like a small island. No champagne bottle was broken across her bow. That tradition was abandoned because it might draw media attention. A handful of Sun shipbuilding executives attended the launch, along with two men in dark suits who identified themselves as representatives of Summa Corporation. They were CIA officers. The Glomar Explorer looked like no ship ever built. Her superstructure was centered amidships, with the enormous derrick rising from a massive A-frame that straddled the center well. Viewed from above, the ship resembled a gigantic rectangular donut, with the moon pool forming the empty center. Journalists who covered the launch described her as futuristic and revolutionary. Marine Engineering magazine published a detailed technical analysis, praising her innovative design for deep-sea mining operations. The article became required reading at naval architecture schools. None of the journalists noticed the ship's extreme weight-carrying capacity, far beyond what would be needed for mining. None questioned why a mining ship needed propulsion systems capable of maintaining precise position against strong currents while hoisting massive loads. None wondered why the center well was reinforced with steel plating strong enough to contain an explosion. The cover story held. The Glomar Explorer spent the next 14 months in final fitting out, installing the winch systems, assembling the pipe string, integrating the navigation computers, testing the dynamic positioning system. In January 1974, the ship sailed from Philadelphia to Long Beach, California, where the capture vehicle was waiting. The CV had been transported by barge from Lockheed's facility, covered by a custom-built shed structure to prevent satellite reconnaissance. Soviet intelligence photographed the barge arriving but couldn't determine what was under the shed. On February 1, 1974, the capture vehicle was loaded into the Glomar Explorer's moon pool in an operation that took 11 hours. The CV hung from the derrick on its lifting cables, slowly lowered through the ship's center well until it locked into docking cradles. Engineers then spent 6 weeks testing every hydraulic system, every pressure sensor, every camera. The CV had never been tested at operational depth, couldn't be tested because lowering it to 16,500 feet would expose the operation. Everything had to work perfectly on the first attempt. There would be no second chance. The crew numbered 178, merchant mariners who believed they were manning a mining ship, CIA officers who knew the truth, security personnel, engineers, medics, and a team of Navy specialists whose presence was never explained to the mariners. The mariners were told the Navy team was conducting classified oceanographic research during the mining operation. They accepted the explanation. Classified programs aboard civilian vessels weren't unusual. In the crew's quarters, a locked safe contained 178 sealed envelopes. Each envelope bore a crew member's name and a red stamp, to be opened only on direct order from the captain. Inside each envelope was a letter explaining Project Azorian's true mission and requiring the recipient to sign a secrecy agreement under penalty of federal prosecution. The captain carried the only key to the safe. He'd been instructed to open it only if the operation was compromised and secrecy could no longer be maintained. On June 20th, 1974, the Hughes Glomar Explorer departed Long Beach, ostensibly bound for a mining site 800 miles northwest of Hawaii. The ship carried enough food and fuel for 90 days. She also carried equipment that would never appear in maritime records. Tissue sampling kits for identifying human remains, radiation detectors for assessing nuclear contamination, cutting torches for dissecting pressure hulls, biohazard suits, embalming fluid, and 50 body bags. The Glomar Explorer was going to K-129's grave to commit the most elaborate act of grave robbery in history. 2 Soviet intelligence vessels shadowed the Glomar Explorer as she left Long Beach. The KGB had finally made the connection. Hughes' ship, unusual design, CIA interest, destination in the Pacific. They suspected Azorian was either a submarine recovery operation or an underwater surveillance platform installation. Either way, they wanted to observe. The 2 Soviet vessels, a modified trawler named Chazma and an AGI intelligence collector designated SB-10, maintained surveillance for 6 days until the Glomar Explorer reached international waters. Then, apparently satisfied the ship was conducting routine operations, they broke off. The CIA team aboard the Glomar Explorer monitored the Soviet vessels constantly. If they'd continued surveillance, the mission would have been aborted. You can't recover a submarine secretly while a Soviet intelligence ship watches. But the KGB made a critical error. They assumed the mining cover story was real. They'd seen the Glomar Explorer's specifications, analyzed her capabilities, concluded she was exactly what Hughes claimed. After all, why would the CIA build a billion-dollar ship to recover a submarine that might be nothing but wreckage? The economics didn't make sense, except that when national security is at stake, economics are irrelevant. On July 4th, 1974, the Hughes Glomar Explorer arrived at the recovery site. 40 degrees 06 N, 179 degrees 57 E, approximately 1,560 nautical miles northwest of Hawaii in international waters. The ocean depth was 16,500 feet. Surface conditions, 8-foot swells, 15-knot winds, visibility 12 miles. Temperature 61 degrees. No other vessels within radar range. The mission clock started at 6:00 a.m. local time. Everything that happened afterward would be measured in hours from H hour. H. The Glomar Explorer activated her dynamic positioning system, using bow and stern thrusters to maintain position against wind and current. Precision was critical. The ship had to remain within 50 feet of the recovery coordinates throughout the operation, or the pipe string would bend and possibly fracture under lateral stress. H-015. Sonar operators lowered a deep tow sonar array to verify K-129's position. The submarine appeared on sonar screens as a large acoustic return with multiple smaller returns scattered around it. The debris field. Target confirmed. Distance from ship, 47 feet horizontal, 16,452 feet vertical. H+130. Engineers began lowering the capture vehicle. The CV descended through the moon pool and entered open ocean, suspended on its lifting cables and guided by thrusters. Descent rate, 100 feet per minute. Estimated time to seafloor, 164 minutes, nearly 3 hours. Camera feeds showed the CV dropping through sunlit water, then through the thermocline into darkness. H-422. The capture vehicle reached the seafloor and hovered 40 feet above K-129's broken hull. Floodlights illuminated a scene from a nightmare. The submarine's forward section lying on its starboard side, partially buried in sediment. The conning tower bent at an unnatural angle, hull plates peeled back like torn paper. The missile section had separated and lay 50 feet away. The aft section was nowhere visible, probably buried. John Parangoski stood in the Glomar Explorer's control room, watching the camera feeds on a bank of television monitors. He'd spent 5 years preparing for this moment. Now, staring at K-129's corpse through cameras 3 miles underwater, he felt something unexpected. Sorrow. 98 men had died inside that hull. Whatever intelligence value their deaths produced, it wouldn't bring them back. He pushed the thought aside. "Begin capture sequence," he ordered. H+445. The capture vehicle positioned itself directly over K-129's forward section. Slowly, at 2 feet per minute, the CV descended. Its 8 claws hung open like the petals of a mechanical flower. Engineers monitored 47 hydraulic systems simultaneously, watching pressure gauges, checking valve positions, listening to pump signatures. Everything had to work perfectly in an environment where the pressure was 7,200 pounds per square inch, enough to crush a human skull like an eggshell. H+512. The claws made contact with K-129's hull. Engineers began closing them slowly, applying just enough pressure to grip without crushing. The submarine's hull was corroded, weakened by 6 years underwater. Too much pressure and it would crumble like paper. Too little and it would slip free during the lift. Then the first claw jammed. The hydraulic pressure gauge for claw number 3 spiked to maximum, then dropped to 0. On the video feed, the claw hung motionless, half closed. Engineers stared at the monitors in silence. Everyone understood what had happened. Either a hydraulic line had ruptured or a valve had frozen. Either way, claw number 3 was inoperative. Parangoski's voice was calm. "Can we lift with 7 claws?" The engineering supervisor, a man named Mitchell, calculated quickly. "Maybe. Depends on how the weight distributes. If it's balanced, yes. If it's not..." He didn't finish the sentence. Everyone knew what would happen if the weight wasn't balanced. The submarine would tear apart during the lift, debris raining down into the abyssal darkness. "Continue capture sequence," Parangoski ordered. H+547. 7 claws locked onto K-129's hull. The 8th hung useless, a monument to the fact that even the most sophisticated engineering can fail at the worst possible moment. The capture vehicle's ballast tanks were flooded to negative buoyancy, anchoring it to the seafloor. Now came the most dangerous phase, beginning the lift while simultaneously starting the pipe string assembly above. The pipe string worked like this. As the CV and submarine rose, the Glomar Explorer's derrick lowered new pipe sections, threading them together to maintain continuous connection. It was analogous to building a bridge while crossing it, except the bridge was 7 miles long, submerged under enormous tension and supporting 2,000 tons of dead weight. H600 propellers. Lift initiated. The CV's ballast tanks began purging. Slowly, at 1 foot per minute, the capture vehicle and its cargo began rising from the seafloor. Sediment billowed up in massive clouds, obscuring the cameras. When the sediment cleared, the submarine was dangling beneath the CV, held by 7 claws, ascending into darkness. The lift would take 112 hours, almost 5 days, at a rate of 3 feet per minute. During that time, the Glomar Explorer had to maintain precise position, the pipe string had to remain intact, and the 7 functioning claws had to hold. If any element failed, the submarine would plunge back to the seafloor, and 5 years of work would be wasted. The control room settled into a routine of controlled tension. Engineers monitored systems in 4-hour shifts. Every gauge was logged every 15 minutes. Video feeds from the CV showed nothing but darkness and the ghostly outline of K129 suspended in floodlights. The pipe string rotated slowly to prevent torsional stress, 10 revolutions per hour, a massive spiral of steel threading through the ocean. At H+24 onslaught, the Soviet intelligence trawler Chazma reappeared on radar, 40 miles away and closing. The KGB had decided to take another look at whatever the Hughes ship was doing. Maybe they'd received new intelligence. Maybe they were just thorough. Either way, their timing was spectacularly bad. For them. The Glomar Explorer was conducting openly what appeared to be mining operations. The derrick was lifting and lowering, just as a mining derrick would. Pipe sections were being assembled, just as drilling operations required. To any observer, including trained KGB officers, the ship was doing exactly what Howard Hughes claimed, mining manganese nodules from the deep ocean floor. Chazma maintained observation for 18 hours, circling at a distance, photographing the Glomar Explorer from multiple angles, then departed. The KGB never discovered they'd been watching the United States steal a Soviet submarine from under their noses. At H+72 Hati, 3 days into the lift, disaster nearly struck. A stress fracture appeared in pipe section number 347, discovered during routine ultrasonic inspection. The pipe was supporting approximately 3.2 million pounds of tension. If it failed, the entire string below that point would plummet, including the capture vehicle and submarine. The fall would accelerate to terminal velocity, approximately 200 feet per second, before impacting the seafloor. The impact would obliterate K129 and possibly damage the CV beyond recovery. Engineers debated options. They could attempt to repair the fracture by welding, but welding under tension risked catastrophic failure. They could halt the lift and transfer weight to a bypass system, but that would take 12 hours and expose the operation to further scrutiny. They could continue lifting and hope the pipe held. Parangosky made the decision. Continue lifting, but slow the rate from 3 feet per minute to 2 feet per minute, reducing stress. Monitor the fracture continuously. If propagation begins, abort immediately. The fracture held. At H+89 Oba, the capture vehicle entered the thermocline, ascending through layers of water where temperature changed by 20 degrees over a 100-foot depth. The rapid temperature shift caused differential expansion in the CV's steel structure. Stress sensors showed distortion in the claw assembly. Engineers watched in real time as claw number 5 began to open, its grip weakening. Then claw number 7 failed completely. The hydraulic pressure dropped to 0. The claw opened. On the video feed, a massive section of K129's hull tore free and tumbled away into darkness. Engineers estimated the section weighed 40 tons, nearly 10% of the submarine's total mass. The remaining 5 claws now supported 1,800 tons, distributed unevenly. The submarine hung at a 20-degree angle, swaying in the current. "Can we continue?" Parangosky asked. Mitchell was staring at the stress readouts. "We're exceeding design limits on claws number 1 and 6. If either fails..." "Can we continue?" Parangosky repeated. "Yes." The lift continued. At H+12 July 9, 1974, 10:00 a.m., the capture vehicle broke the surface inside the Glomar Explorer's moon pool. Massive steel doors closed beneath the ship, sealing the moon pool from the ocean. Pumps began evacuating seawater. As the water level dropped, K129's shattered hull emerged like something from a fever dream. A submarine broken in half, held by 5 claws, covered in marine growth and rust, leaking oil and hydraulic fluid. The forward section had survived. The missile section had not. It had torn away when claw number 7 failed. Of K129's 3 R-21 ballistic missiles, the Glomar Explorer recovered 0. Of the nuclear warheads, 0. Of the nuclear torpedoes, 0. The CIA had spent $800 million in 5 years to recover 1/3 of a Soviet submarine. But that 1/3 contained everything that mattered: the control room, the cipher machines, the code books, the targeting documentation, and the bodies of 38 crew members preserved in the cold water, still at their stations. For the next 3 weeks, CIA analysts dissected K129 inside the Glomar Explorer's sealed hangar bay. They worked 12-hour shifts, cutting through bulkheads with acetylene torches, cataloging every component, photographing everything before disturbing it. The smell was horrific. 6 years of decomposition accelerated by exposure to air. Biohazard teams wore full protective suits, respirators strapped tight. The cipher machines were corroded but intact. 2 magnetophone tape systems and 1 KL-47 rotor machine, all removed carefully and packed in hermetically sealed containers filled with inert gas. The codebooks had dissolved into pulp, but cryptographers believed some pages might be recoverable using chemical treatments and infrared photography. The navigation logs were readable, and they confirmed what American intelligence had suspected. K-129 had been positioned to launch nuclear strikes against Pearl Harbor, San Diego, and Naval Air Station Alameda. The targeting coordinates were precise. The missiles had been ready to fire on 5 minutes' notice. The submarine's reactor compartment, which had separated and fallen back to the seafloor, wasn't recovered, but the forward torpedo room was intact. It contained 2 nuclear torpedoes with 15-kiloton warheads. CIA weapons analysts spent 4 days carefully disassembling the warheads, documenting Soviet nuclear weapon design features that had been purely theoretical until that moment. The metallurgy of the plutonium pit revealed manufacturing techniques that suggested Soviet warhead production was less sophisticated than American. Estimates had indicated valuable intelligence that would inform arms control negotiations years later. But the most disturbing discoveries were human. 38 bodies, many still strapped into their stations or curled in sleeping berths. They'd died instantly when the submarine imploded. The pressure differential had killed them before they could drown. Their faces were preserved, eyes closed, mouths open in silent screams that never escaped. Personal effects were cataloged: wedding rings, photographs, letters from wives and children. A pocket watch stopped at 2:44 a.m. Captain Kobzer was identified by his rank insignia and the identification papers in his wallet. His body was found in the control room, one hand still gripping a pipe railing, the other reaching toward the emergency blow system. A final, futile attempt to surface the dying submarine. CIA psychologists later analyzed the positioning and concluded Kobzar had remained conscious for perhaps 3 seconds after the implosion began, long enough to understand what was happening, but not long enough to save anyone. John Parangosky ordered the bodies treated with respect. They were enemy personnel, but they were also men who died serving their country. The bodies were cleaned, identified when possible, wrapped in canvas, and placed in aluminum caskets. Parangosky drafted a message to CIA Director William Colby. Request guidance on disposition of recovered Soviet personnel remains. Colby's response arrived 6 hours later. Burial at sea, full honors, film the ceremony, but encrypt the footage top secret, notify no one. On July 28, 1974, at 6 o'clock a.m., the Hughes Glomar Explorer's crew assembled on the aft deck. A chaplain read a modified naval burial service. The Soviet Navy ensign, a flag recovered from K-129, was draped over each casket in turn. 6 crew members served as pallbearers, carrying each casket to the stern rail. A rifle squad fired 3 volleys. Not the traditional American 3-volley salute, but a gesture of respect between sailors. 38 caskets were committed to the sea, sliding down an angled platform into the Pacific. The chaplain spoke in Russian. A CIA translator had phonetically written out the Orthodox prayer for the dead. Vechna Pamit, eternal memory. The chaplain repeated 38 times as each casket disappeared beneath the waves. The entire ceremony was filmed by 3 cameras. The footage was classified top secret Umbra and sealed in CIA vaults, not to be released for decades. The burial location was recorded: 40°06 N, 179 and 57 E, directly above K-129's final resting place, where 60 unrecovered crew members still lay in the wreckage. Later that morning, Parangosky assembled the crew in the mess deck. He unlocked the safe containing the sealed envelopes and distributed them. "Open these now," he ordered. "Read them carefully, then sign the enclosed secrecy agreements." The merchant mariners opened their envelopes and discovered they'd been working on a CIA operation to steal a Soviet submarine. Some reacted with shock, some with pride. One engineer, a man named Phillips, stood up. "Are we going back for the rest of it?" he asked. "I don't know," Parangosky said honestly. "That's above my clearance level." The Hughes Glomar Explorer departed the recovery site on August 3, 1974, bound for Pearl Harbor. In her secured hangar bay, she carried approximately 200 tons of Soviet submarine components, packed in crates marked Machinery Parts, Summa Corporation, Deep Ocean Mining Division. At Pearl Harbor, the crates were offloaded at night and transported to Travis Air Force Base by C-141 cargo aircraft, then flown to CIA facilities in Virginia and Maryland for analysis. The mission had cost $800 million, approximately $4.8 billion in 2025 dollars. It had required 5 years of planning, 1,200 personnel, the construction of the largest specialty vessel ever built, and the invention of entirely new technologies. It had recovered 1/3 of a Soviet submarine. Was it worth it? The intelligence windfall from Project Azorian remained classified for decades, but fragments eventually emerged through declassified documents and memoirs. The cipher machines, though corroded, provided enough information to confirm that Soviet naval codes in 1968 had used an encryption system vulnerable to cryptanalysis, meaning that years of intercepted Soviet naval communications, previously indecipherable, could potentially be decoded retroactively. The National Security Agency assigned a team of 30 crypt analysts to the project. They worked for 3 years and successfully decrypted approximately 16% of the archived intercepts, revealing Soviet submarine patrol routes, operational doctrines, and weaknesses in acoustic signature management. The nuclear torpedo warheads provided hard evidence that Soviet tactical nuclear weapons used a plutonium pit design with lower compression efficiency than American weapons, suggesting Soviet miniaturization efforts were several years behind U.S. capabilities. This intelligence directly informed SALT II arms control negotiations in 1976-77, allowing American negotiators to push for more restrictive limits on Soviet delivery systems. The targeting data recovered from K-129's navigation computers confirmed that Soviet Gulf II submarines were pre-positioned for rapid nuclear strikes against U.S. Pacific bases. This intelligence led to upgraded air defense systems at Pearl Harbor and increased ASW patrols in Soviet submarine operating areas. Some strategic analysts argued the intelligence prevented a nuclear Pearl Harbor scenario by exposing Soviet capabilities before they could be used. But the most significant intelligence wasn't technical, it was strategic. Project Azorian proved that the United States could conduct an operation of extraordinary complexity and audacity without Soviet detection. The psychological impact on Soviet leadership was profound when they eventually learned what had happened. If the Americans could steal a submarine from the ocean floor without anyone noticing, what else could they do? The uncertainty bred paranoia, which bred strategic miscalculation, which created intelligence opportunities. For 18 months, Project Azorian remained secret. Then on February 8, 1975, investigative journalist Seymour Hersh published a story in the New York Times revealing that the CIA had attempted to recover a Soviet submarine using a ship built by Howard Hughes. Hersh didn't have all the details, his sources had provided fragments, but he had enough to expose the operation's existence. The CIA issued a rare public statement. We can neither confirm nor deny the existence of any operation described in the article. The phrase neither confirm nor deny entered the American lexicon, eventually abbreviated as a GLOMAR response. It became standard bureaucratic language for non-denial denials. The Soviets reacted with fury and embarrassment. How had the Americans located K-129 when Soviet search operations had failed? How had they recovered it without detection? And most importantly, what had they found inside? The Soviet Navy launched an investigation that concluded multiple failures had enabled the operation. Inadequate search technology, poor security around naval bases, CIA informants had possibly provided K-129's patrol route, and complacency in monitoring American intelligence activities. KGB Chairman Yuri Andropov ordered a review of all sensitive operations. The review revealed that CIA had successfully penetrated Soviet naval operations at multiple levels, using SOSUS hydrophones, satellite reconnaissance, human sources, and technical operations like Azorian. Andropov reportedly told the Politburo, "The Americans are 10 years ahead of us in underwater intelligence. We are fighting blind." The revelation sparked Soviet efforts to develop equivalent deep ocean recovery capabilities. Throughout the late 1970s, Soviet shipyards built specialized salvage vessels with capabilities similar to the Glomar Explorer. By 1983, the Soviet Navy had recovered several downed reconnaissance satellites from the ocean floor using techniques reverse-engineered from open-source analysis of Azorian. The technology race had spawned a salvage race. In Washington, Congress launched investigations into CIA spending on Azorian. Senator Stuart Symington called it the most expensive single intelligence operation in American history. Congressional hearings in 1976 revealed the $800 million price tag and questioned whether the intelligence justified the expense. CIA Director Colby defended the operation in classified testimony, showing congressmen photographs of the recovered cipher machines and nuclear weapons. The hearings concluded that Azorian had been worthwhile, but established new oversight requirements for extraordinarily expensive covert operations. Several careers ended because of Azorian. John Parangosky retired from CIA in 1976, his role in the operation finally acknowledged internally but never publicly. He received the CIA's Distinguished Intelligence Medal in a closed ceremony attended by 7 people. The citation remained classified. Parangosky died in 2001, age 78, and his obituary mentioned only that he'd worked in classified capacities for the U.S. government. Curtis Crook, the naval architect who'd designed the Glomar Explorer, found his career unexpectedly enhanced. After Azorian was revealed, defense contractors and oil companies sought his expertise in deep ocean engineering. He designed 5 more specialty vessels for ocean floor operations before retiring in 1989, wealthy from patents on technology originally developed for submarine salvage. 3 CIA officers involved in Azorian were later compromised by Soviet intelligence. How the KGB identified them remains unclear, possibly through analysis of who had access to K-129 information, possibly through a mole inside CIA. One officer, David Barnett, was arrested in 1980 for selling classified information to the Soviets. His espionage predated Azorian, but during interrogation he admitted providing details about the operation. He served 18 years in federal prison. For the crew of the Glomar Explorer, the operation became a strange footnote to their lives. Most signed the secrecy agreements and never spoke about what they'd witnessed. A few wrote memoirs after the operation was declassified in the 1990s. One merchant mariner, interviewed in 2003, described the moment he opened the sealed envelope. "I thought they were joking. I thought it was some kind of test. Then I saw the Soviet submarine sitting in our cargo hold and realized everything I'd believed about my job was a lie. Strangest feeling I ever had." The Hughes Glomar Explorer had one more mission. In 1975, despite the operation's exposure, CIA planned a second recovery attempt targeting K-129's missile section, still lying on the ocean floor. The ship deployed to the recovery site in July 1975, but Soviet surveillance was now constant. 3 intelligence vessels shadowed the Glomar Explorer continuously. The mission was aborted after 2 weeks. The CIA acknowledged that surprise, the key ingredient in Azorian's success, was gone. The ship was mothballed in 1977, transferred to the Navy, and eventually leased to oil companies for deep-sea drilling. In 1997, she was renamed GSF Explorer and converted for offshore oil exploration. Workers cutting away CIA-era equipment discovered sealed compartments containing classified materials that hadn't been removed during decommissioning, technical manuals, encrypted communications logs, and a series of photographs showing K-129's interior. The photographs were turned over to the CIA, which classified them anew and filed them in archives already bulging with Azorian materials. By then, the Cold War was over. The Soviet Union had collapsed. K-129's secrets seemed quaint, relics of a paranoid age. But intelligence never loses value. It just gains historical context. In 1993, Russian President Boris Yeltsin formally requested American assistance in locating and documenting Soviet submarine wrecks, including K-129. The request was part of broader U.S.-Russian military cooperation following the USSR's dissolution. The U.S. Navy provided the coordinates of K-129's wreck site and offered to conduct a joint survey mission. Russian naval officers who reviewed the data were stunned by its precision. The Americans had known K-129's exact location since 1968, within days of the sinking. The implications were sobering. For 6 years, while Soviet families mourned and the Pacific Fleet conducted futile searches, the United States had been planning to steal the submarine. The revelation reopened old wounds and complicated post-Cold War reconciliation efforts. In 2003, Russia requested that the United States return all recovered materials from K-129, including the remains of the 60 crew members whose bodies hadn't been buried at sea in 1974. The State Department's response was a masterpiece of diplomatic evasion. The U.S. government would neither confirm nor deny retaining any materials from any operation that may or may not have occurred. A Glomar response about Project Glomar. Frustrated, Russian officials asked at least for information about the burial site where the 38 recovered crew members had been committed to the sea. After internal debate, CIA agreed to release the video footage of the burial ceremony, along with the exact coordinates. The footage was delivered to the Russian embassy in Washington on September 15, 2003, in a sealed diplomatic pouch. Russian officials who watched the video wept. The footage showed American sailors conducting a full military funeral for Soviet submariners, reading prayers in phonetic Russian, folding the Soviet naval ensign with precision and respect. One Russian naval officer, himself a submarine veteran, said afterward, "They treated our dead better than our own government did. We abandoned K-129. The Americans gave them honor." The video was broadcast on Russian state television in 2006 during a documentary about K-129. The footage of American sailors saluting as Soviet caskets slid into the Pacific created an unexpected cultural moment. A recognition that even at the height of Cold War hostility, some human connections transcended ideology. Memorial services were held in Russia 32 years late for the 98 men of K-129. Families finally had closure, and a burial location where they could place flowers, even if only symbolically. In 2007, the CIA began systematically declassifying Azorian documents. Over the next 5 years, approximately 40% of the project's files were released to the National Archives, including engineering schematics for the Glomar Explorer, operational logs, cost accounting records, and after-action reports. The technical details fascinated engineers and historians, the pipe string calculations, the hydraulic system designs, the dynamic positioning algorithms. But some files remained classified. Specifically, the complete inventory of what was recovered from K-129, detailed cryptanalytic results from the cipher machines, and any intelligence that might reveal American capabilities to identify Soviet submarines acoustically. These files carried classification extensions through 2040, ensuring they'd remain secret for at least 70 years after the operation. Why? Because intelligence sources and methods never truly expire. The SOSUS hydrophone network that detected K-129's sinking is still operational, now maintained by NOAA for oceanographic research, but available to the Navy for national security purposes. The deep ocean engineering techniques developed for Azorian are still relevant. Every modern deep-sea salvage operation uses technologies pioneered by the Glomar Explorer. And the strategic lesson that submarines can be located and recovered even from extreme depths remains a deterrent factor in modern submarine operations. The wreck of K-129 still lies at 40°86 in 179°57 E, approximately 16,500 feet below the surface. The forward section that the CIA recovered has been replaced by scattered debris, the pieces that tore away during the lift and fell back. The missile section is intact, corroding slowly in the cold water. The reactor section, still sealed, leaks trace amounts of radiation, monitored periodically by unmanned submersibles. 60 bodies remain inside the wreck, entombed in steel, beyond recovery. The Russian government has designated the site a military grave, protected under international maritime law. It is illegal to disturb the wreck or remove any materials. Not that anyone would try. At that depth, even modern salvage operations would cost hundreds of millions of dollars. In 2017, a Russian television crew chartered a deep-sea submersible and filmed the wreck site for a documentary. The footage showed marine life colonizing the hull, sea anemones, tube worms, bacterial mats glowing faintly in the submersible's lights. Nature had reclaimed K-129, transforming a weapon of war into a reef ecosystem. The documentary's narrator posed a question. Was Project Azorian worth the cost and risk? The question remains unanswered. Intelligence agencies don't measure success in dollars. They measure it in prevented catastrophes, in wars avoided, in capabilities exposed. Did Azorian prevent a Soviet nuclear first strike by revealing their targeting strategies? Possibly. Did it give American cryptanalysts keys to unlock Soviet communications? Partially. Did it demonstrate American technological superiority and strategic boldness? Absolutely. But it also demonstrated something darker. The lengths to which nations will go for intelligence, the human cost of secrecy, and the strange ethics of a world where stealing a submarine full of dead men is considered a legitimate military operation. One final detail revealed in declassified documents in 2018. The CIA knew from the beginning that recovering the entire submarine was unlikely. Engineering studies conducted in 1970 estimated a 40% probability of total structural failure during the lift. The operation proceeded anyway because even partial recovery would provide valuable intelligence. When Claw No. 3 jammed and then Claw No. 7 failed, engineers aboard the Glomar Explorer knew the submarine was tearing apart. They could have aborted, lowered K-129 back to the seafloor, attempted a more careful second attempt. But Azorian's planners had always known there would be no second attempt. It was all or nothing. Recover what you can and accept the loss. So they continued lifting as the submarine disintegrated, as 40-ton sections tore away and plummeted into darkness, as the missile section, the target they'd spent 5 years and $800 million pursuing, broke free and fell. They continued because the alternative was admitting failure, and the CIA doesn't admit failure easily. This calculus, the willingness to accept catastrophic mechanical failure, to watch millions of dollars of equipment tumble into the abyss, to lose the primary objective and claim the secondary objective as victory, this is the essence of Cold War intelligence operations. Success was measured not by whether you achieved your goal, but by whether you survived the attempt with something to show for it. Project Azorian survived. It retrieved 1/3 of K-129, recovered critical intelligence, demonstrated American capabilities, and remained secret long enough to extract maximum strategic value. By any reasonable measure, it was a success, but standing in the Glomar Explorer's control room at H-Plow 89 Oahu, watching Claw No. 7 fail and K-129's missile section tumble away on the video feed, John Parangoski didn't feel successful. He felt like a man watching 5 years of work disintegrate in real time, powerless to stop it. Continue the lift, he'd said. Because what else could he say? Because the operation had moved beyond human control, committed to its trajectory like a satellite burning through re-entry. Because sometimes the most courageous decision is to accept failure and salvage what you can from the wreckage. This is what no documentary ever captures about Cold War operations. The moment when everything goes wrong, when the plan collapses, when all that remains is stubbornness and improvisation and the desperate hope that partial success beats total failure. The Glomar Explorer lifted K-129's shattered forward section through 16,500 feet of ocean. It wasn't what anyone wanted. It wasn't what anyone planned. But it was enough. Today, the GSF Explorer, formerly the Hughes Glomar Explorer, sits rusting at Suisun Bay Reserve Fleet in California, awaiting scrapping. Her massive derrick has been removed. The center well has been sealed. The moon pool, that once contained a Soviet submarine, now holds only rainwater and pigeon droppings. Occasionally, maritime historians visit the ship, standing on her weathered deck, trying to imagine her glory days. But the ship is just steel and rust. The real legacy of Project Azorian exists in classified archives, in cryptanalytic breakthroughs that shifted Cold War balances, in technologies that transformed deep ocean engineering, in strategic calculations that prevented escalation. The operation succeeded not because it recovered a submarine, but because it demonstrated that nothing, not ocean depth, not Soviet secrecy, not technological barriers, could protect strategic assets from American intelligence. The Soviets learned this lesson. So did every other nation with submarine fleets. After Azorian, no one could assume their sunken vessels were safe from recovery. Scuttling procedures were revised. Self-destruct mechanisms were improved. Classified materials were designed to dissolve in seawater. The entire doctrine of submarine operations changed because one operation proved that the ocean floor wasn't a grave. It was an intelligence archive, accessible to those with sufficient technology and determination. This was Azorian's true achievement, not what it recovered, but what it revealed about American capabilities. And in intelligence work, revelation is power. At 40 degrees 6 N, 179-57 E, 3 miles down, K-129 continues her eternal watch. The control room where Captain Kobzar died is gone. Recovered by the CIA, dissected in American laboratories, eventually destroyed and buried in classified waste sites. But the missile section remains, corroding slowly, releasing secrets atom by atom into the cold water. 60 bodies lie inside, sailors who never imagined their grave would become the target of the most elaborate salvage operation in history, that their deaths would trigger technological revolutions, that American engineers would spend 5 years designing machines to reach them. They served their country. They died at their posts. And then, without their knowledge or consent, they became intelligence assets. This is the brutal arithmetic of the Cold War. People become objects, deaths become opportunities, graves become targets. Project Azorian embodied this arithmetic completely. It was brilliant and terrible, an engineering marvel serving morally ambiguous ends, an operation that simultaneously honored and violated the men it sought to recover. In the end, perhaps that contradiction is Azorian's most lasting legacy. We remember it as a triumph of American ingenuity, but we should also remember it as a reminder of what intelligence agencies will do when national security overrides human dignity, when geopolitical advantage justifies disturbing the dead, when the Cold War's logic reduced men to strategic assets and graves to intelligence repositories. The Glomar Explorer raised 1/3 of K-129 from the ocean floor, but she couldn't raise the question that should haunt us. In pursuing security, what humanity did we sacrifice? In winning the intelligence war, what moral boundaries did we cross? These questions have no declassification date. They remain sealed in the deepest archives of all, the ones we carry in conscience, where no FOIA request can reach. The ocean keeps the rest of its secrets. 3 miles down, in permanent darkness, K-129 waits. 60 men wait. And the Cold War, which never really ended, just transformed into something we call by other names, continues its silent watch in the deep.